You ready to go?
I'm ready to go.
All right, great. So welcome everyone. This is Rena Greifinger speaking, the Youth and Girls Advisor for PSI. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar on Gender and Adolescence 360. We're really excited to talk to you and engage with you and talk about how we're going to address gender, the big G, in this ambitious project. So you're going to hear today from me as well as Clarissa Lord-Brundage, who's the Program Officer for Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and our dear and loving Program Officer for Adolescence 360, also a gender expert in her own right. So moving forward, our discussion today, we are going to do some gender basics. So for some of you who've been through gender training or familiar with the gender world, some of this might be repeat information for you, but we like to do some level setting just to make sure everybody understands kind of what are we talking about when we're talking about gender and sexual and reproductive health? What are we talking about when we talk about gender integration? We're going to talk through the gender equality continuum and then what it really means to be gender transformative. So Clarissa is going to present that, and then I'm going to take us into kind of how this is all being applied in Adolescence 360. So just to do some quick level setting, I want to just set the tone and acknowledge the underlying assumption that gender inequality exists everywhere, all countries and cultures. And in the places where we work, and particularly in the 3 project countries for Adolescence 360, gender inequality can often manifest in much more obvious and harmful ways. There's ample literature on the impact of gender inequality on women, particularly, on the world, on countries, on economies, and on our own programs. But we're not going to spend our time on this webinar really analyzing the effect of gender inequality. Rather, we're going to mostly focus on how we are applying a gender lens to our work to try to address that inequality. And in this pause, I just would like to ask everybody who's recently joined to please mute your phones or microphones. And Clarissa, take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rena, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be on this webinar. I remember I was at the boot camp in Ethiopia, I guess just about a month ago or so, and this was a figment of our imagination to do this webinar, so it's great that it's happening. And I also wanted to say that to not fear that we are not adding yet another discipline to Adolescence 360, but more just wanted to have a conversation about gender equality, and what that means, so that we can all have this in the back of our minds as we're going through Adolescence 360 and the inspiration phase. I know that when I was in Ethiopia and we did the activity on kind of what was most important to a group of unmarried girls, and you know, we had the cards with some of the examples around earning money and making friends and making your family proud, and then we went to the portion where we asked them, well, do you have any cards you want to create? And one of them was around freedom and wanting girls and recognizing that they had less of it because they were girls. So I think there's already some things that are related to gender and equality that are coming up that I'm eager to have a conversation with everyone about this morning. So Rena and I are going to present a few slides, and then there will be time for questions and discussion at the end. So jumping in, I think we all know that gender is an important consideration in development. It's a way of looking at how social norms and power structures impact the lives and opportunities that are available to different groups of women and men. And so I just wanted to very, in a simplified way, show the difference between sex and gender, because sometimes we get these confused. So, hoping my animations will work, sex is the biological differences, anatomy, hormones that make someone male or female. Whereas gender is the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that a society considers appropriate for men and women. Gender identity is a person's psychological sense of self as a man or a woman, as well as how you express your identity as masculine or feminine. So sex, are things that, are penises and vaginas, very basically. And gender it's not universal, it's not cross-cultural, and it can change over time. Gender norms are societal messages that dictate what is appropriate or expected behavior for males and females. And I think we're all starting to see that gender and norms play a role in the outcomes that we're going to try to achieve through Adolescence 360. I wanted to do a quick try to have a somewhat interactive exercise. So for those of you who are have connected through your laptop, if you could, in the chat box, type your response. So my question is, for an example, if someone menstruates, is that an example of sex or gender? So just type in your response in the chat box. Very exciting. People are typing sex, 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 sex. Okay, excellent. You're all correct. Thank you. That was really fun. Okay, the next one is plays football, sex or gender? Gender, we get all the genders. Okay, so everyone is very familiar with this. I think yes, great. Excellent. So strong is an example of gender, produces sperm. This is a biological difference. Sex, I'm just going to go through it because you guys are all clearly very familiar with this. Good at cooking and cleaning is an example of gender. Both men and women can be good at cooking and cleaning. And then independent, again, is an example of gender. So I'm going to move along to talk about gender and sexual and reproductive health. There are many ways that gender inequality and gender norms impact women's sexual and reproductive health. For example, unequal power relations within the household can constrain women's ability to control the timing and frequency of sex with her partner, to control decisions about whether to use contraception or how many children to have. Women whose partners threaten them with violence or withdrawal of financial resources may not be able to negotiate safe sex or prevent unintentional pregnancies. And women with little education have difficulty understanding and accessing health messages or requesting reliable, unbiased information from healthcare providers. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about gender integration, which is the process of creating knowledge and awareness of, as well as responsibility for addressing gender in both health systems and programs. So when we think about health programs for women and girls, we often assume that if we're focusing on women and girls, we are also focusing on gender. However, a focus on women's health does not necessarily include examination of how women's health is affected by inequalities in the division of labor, of allocations of resources, decision-making, power, or mobility. Men and boys are rarely engaged as part of women-focused health activities, and as a result, differences in health outcomes between women and men are often treated as fundamentally related to differences in the sex-linked physiological differences that align with their different goals. So for example, women are regarded as the primary caretakers of children because of their physiological capacity to give birth. Consequently, women-focused health programs often target women with health messages as the principal caretakers of others in the household. And this can be without regard for any additional burdens that may entail, how women's own health may be adversely affected as being considered the primary caregiver, how their capacity to implement the promoted practices because of potential restrictions on their decision-making, resources, or mobility, and how others could share responsibilities such as husbands, in-laws, or other family members. In contrast, a focus on gender inequality examines how differences in power relations result in differential risks, exposures, vulnerabilities, and outcomes in health for men and women. Gender integrated approaches treat women's and men's relative social, political, economic, educational, and health status as interrelated, intersectional, and interdependent. So to be successful, gender-focused health programs often have to be multi-sectoral, which I think we're learning a lot about for Adolescence 360, and engage a wide variety of women and men stakeholders, regardless of whether the focus of the program is on women's, children's, or men's health. So Rena is going to talk about this more, but in Adolescence 360, we're already starting to take a gender-integrated approach by including young men and women as design researchers, and including boys, husbands, and other male stakeholders in the inspiration phase. So I'm now going to walk everyone through a gender equality continuum. So the first box here is gender blind, which ignores the set of economic, social, political roles, rights, responsibilities associated with being female and male. It ignores the power dynamics between and among women and men and girls and boys. An example of this from the reproductive health field is prevention of mother-to-child transmission of HIV program that does not address women's fear of abandonment or divorce after a positive HIV test. Gender aware examines and addresses gender consideration and adopts an approach along the following continuum. And there are different ways that programs can be gender aware, but ultimately the goal is to really have improved gender health and development outcomes. So the furthest left along the continuum would be a gender exploitative program, which reinforces or takes advantage of gender inequalities and stereotypes. An example of this might be appealing to male opinion leaders as gatekeepers of women's reproductive health, and inadvertently reinforcing male decision-making power by involving men in their female partners' healthcare without any sort of capacity building to counteract providers' tendency to direct information primarily to the man and not the woman. A gender accommodating program is one that works around existing gender differences and inequalities. So one example would be delivering contraceptive supplies to women's doorsteps in places where their mobility outside the home is limited. We know that doorstep distribution has helped raise prevalence rates in many countries and given women the power to control their fertility as they desire. But in most cases, doorstep distribution does little to challenge the belief that women who leave the home without a male relative's permission are not respectable. Gender transformative programs foster examination of gender norms and dynamics. They seek to strengthen or create systems that support gender equality and strengthen or create equitable gender norms and dynamics. One example of this strategy might support perhaps community dialogue to rebalance gender relations so that men and women would support women's rights to attend a clinic without the need to secure her male relative's permission. So as a planning framework, it can help to determine how to move along the continuum toward more transformative gender programming. It's important to emphasize that programmatic interventions should always aim to be gender aware and move toward the right and toward transformative gender programming. It's also important to ensure that the program does not adopt a gender blind approach, which I think already Adolescence 360 is not doing, given that we've done the gender and power dynamic evaluations, and that really we if we were to be gender blind, we could unintentionally be causing harm. And we also don't want to exploit harmful or negative gender norms. So I wanted to make that very clear in this slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about gender transformative programs. Gender transformative programs with women are often designed to examine and challenge patriarchy. However, this work with women may look quite different from work with men. Programs for men focus primarily on changing social norms about gender roles and expectations, whereas work with women often focuses more prominently on deconstructing sources of power that will further perpetuate the oppression of women. So gender transformative approaches actively strive to examine, question, and change rigid gender norms and the imbalance of power. And these approaches can be targeted at men or women. They encourage critical awareness among men and women of gender roles, promote the position of women, and challenge the distribution of resources and allocation of duties between men and women. I also wanted to talk briefly on gender synchronized approaches. This was not in the spectrum or the continuum, but it is something that we are, hearing and learning more about in the field. And while it's not, I think, an approach that we're taking for Adolescence 360, we did want the consortium to be aware of this model. So gender synchronized approaches are the intentional intersection of gender transformative efforts reaching both men and boys and women and girls. It engages people in challenging harmful and restrictive constructions of masculinity and femininity, and gender equality is seen as a measure of program success. So some of the things that gender synchronized approaches seek to influence are intentionality in reaching out to both sexes to promote mutual understanding, equalization and the balance of power, freedom from violence, human rights for both men and women. So this was just something that we wanted the consortium to be aware of, but recognizing that in the context of Adolescence 360, we remain focused on our outcomes for improving, contraceptive prevalence for adolescent girls, and the ways that we get there might include engagement with men and boys, but that we are not seeking kind of programming efforts that will be targeted at men and boys, both, and women and girls. So lastly, I'm going to end with just a quick example of a program that has integrated gender. I chose one that was focused on an adolescent population and included outcomes in the sexual and reproductive health field that I think is kind of pretty similar to what we're trying to do with Adolescence 360. So the Empowerment and Livelihood for Adolescents program conducted by BRAC and Poverty Action Lab in Uganda. The objectives were to examine the impact of a combination of life skills and vocational training on female youth, ages 14 to 20, on their health knowledge, risky behaviors, and engagement in income-generating activities. So this was a kind of multi-sectoral program in that it included both an aspect on health and an aspect on economics. The gender issues that they're trying to address with this program were the pressure to marry and have children at a young age, and the lack of job opportunities for women and means for income generation. So the intervention itself was a program operated through adolescent development clubs, and each club included about 20 to 35 girls. There were two forms of skills training, life skills and livelihoods training, And the topics covered in the life skills training included SRH, menstruation, pregnancy, STIs and HIV, family planning and rape, as well as more of those kind of broader development skills such as management, negotiation and conflict resolution, and leadership. So some of the results from this program in the economic side, and this was evaluated using a randomized control trial among just about 4,800 girls in the follow-up survey. Prior to the introduction of the program, only 6.5% of girls reported being self-employed. And following the intervention, girls were 32% more likely to engage in income-generating activities. The health outcomes, initially 51% of girls reported that they always used a condom when sexually active, and 11% had at least one child. Self-reported condom usage increased by 50% among girls who were sexually active, and the probability of giving birth decreased by 26%. Then there were some outcomes around gender and agency. There was a 76% reduction in adolescent girls reporting having had sex against their will. And girls who were in the treatment group, their expectations around age of first marriage, around the ideal age of marriage and childbearing, the number of children, the expectations and aspirations that they had for their future sons and daughters, the expectation that females should earn money, all changed for the better through this project. And I think these are some of the types of outcomes and changes that we might expect to see and strive for with Adolescence 360, and really recognizing the interplay between, a girl's agency and her desire and aspirations, and how that impacts her ability and use of family planning. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rena, and I'm going to stop sharing so that Rena can take over.
Okay, hoping everybody can see my screen and hear me. So I thank you so much, Clarissa. So this is a pretty simple diagram that is going to kind of frame my discussion moving forward about how to apply this gender lens in Adolescence 360 and what we are already doing to make sure that we are striving towards gender transformative approaches in the project. So to begin, we start with a gender analysis, and I'll go into that in more detail in a moment. And what that gender analysis does for us is to help to inform the way we design our programs, implement our programs, and evaluate our programs, so that at the end we come out with outcomes that are, again, kind of on the pathway towards gender equality, and of course improved health impact, which is our overall outcome measure of success for the project. So we are really committed to addressing gender at all levels of this project, certainly in terms of being gender aware, but as I said, really striving towards being gender transformative. So a gender power analysis is used to understand the ways in which gender norms influence girls' access to contraceptive information, products, and services. Of course, that's in the context of this project, is how we used a gender analysis. So during our inception phase, which was the first few months of the project, we undertook a gender power analysis in each country. And this analysis looked at the roles and status that men and women, boys and girls, have in the communities where we're working, and how those roles at the household level, the community level, the political level, might impact a girl's being able to access contraception. The application of this lens means considering the commonalities and differences between women's and men's attitudes towards contraception and contraceptive services, the extent to which women and girls perceive men and boys to be supportive of their use of contraception, as well as a girl's self-efficacy or perceived capability to use contraception given the constraints posed by her gender, her age, her lifestyle, etc. So this lens also accounts for concepts of sexuality and perceptions surrounding sexual pleasure and sexual power dynamics. And it's important that we examine these inequalities at the beginning of the project so that we can address them throughout our planned activities. So our country teams used a lot of secondary literature, as well as some information that they gathered through key informant interviews and partner discussions, to answer a number of questions about gender norms, roles, expectations, and influences on sexual and reproductive health. So we actually put together a template of these questions that our country teams went out and answered through a lot of analysis of existing research and some of their own research. So this is an example of a summary analysis that Ethiopia put together. Each of our countries put together a summary analysis with key information gathered through this process. So in this example, we see, for instance, that boys and men are expected to make household decisions, that boys and men really hold the power when it comes to sexual decision-making and reproductive decision-making. And so this is very important for us to note if we're thinking about, who do we target with an intervention? Even if the outcome we're looking for is uptake of contraception among girls, if boys and men continue to really hold the power to make reproductive health decisions, then we know that we need to also work with boys and men to be able to transition that power to girls and women, and to find ways for boys, men, girls, and women to make reproductive health decisions together. We also see that there's high rates of child marriage and expectations to prove fertility as soon as a girl gets married. So this might influence how we target married girls, for instance. We might find that, with married girls, many of whom already have a child, our ambition might be to space the second or third pregnancy rather than trying to delay a first pregnancy. We also see that girls place a lot of status on older women that have succeeded in employment. So when we're thinking about key influencers on a girl's life, it's important to look at who are their role models and influencers. And we see that kind of older women, older role models, women who've kind of achieved in education and employment are important influencers to these girls' lives. So that's just a quick synopsis, and these analyses are available to everybody, within the project and within PSI. So please let me know if you'd like to see them. It is important to note that gender analysis doesn't stop here at this inception phase, that we are going to continue to examine these norms and incorporate this lens throughout different phases of the project, as well as look at any changes that we might be able to make, even on a small scale, through our interventions. So the analysis is really ongoing. Critical to gender transformative approaches is the meaningful engagement of men and boys throughout the project. In many of the communities we're working in, men are not only the sexual partners of the girls that we're trying to reach, but as I said, they really are the gatekeepers to those girls accessing information, products, and services. And so they can play a huge role as facilitators or as barriers. They can be champions or they can be violators of a girl's rights and opportunities. So it's important that our interventions target men and boys, not, as Clarissa said, to just use them as gatekeepers and get their permission, for instance, for their wife or girlfriend or daughter to access contraception, but actually to engage them to foster gender equitable attitudes and to really catalyze their support for women and girls to make contraceptive reproductive health decisions on their own. We know that norms around masculinity influence men and boys to take risks themselves, to perpetrate violence, and again, to make decisions for girls and women instead of with them. And norms related to femininity often include girls and women taking on submissive roles, which prevents them from asserting themselves. So interventions that engage men and boys might include participatory group discussions and education, mass media campaigns, community mobilization activities. We've already begun male engagement by including young men as our peer researchers and young designers. They're collaborating with us side by side in our research and later in our design. We aren't singling them out or treating them differently. They're simply collaborators. And through that collaboration, they're becoming champions. And that in and of itself is transformative. So in Ethiopia, for instance, we interviewed an 18-year-old young designer, Eliab, and the full interview is on our blog, so please check it out. But Eliab said that before joining our team, the A360 team, he hadn't even really thought about contraception. And now he's really becoming a champion for contraception and for a girl's right to contraception and to making decisions over her body. You know, this is really about changing norms, and when to change norms, we really need to change mindsets, and to change mindsets, we need to inspire critical thinking. So if we can inspire girls and boys, men and women to examine the norms in their culture, to question harmful traditions, to challenge those norms and expectations that seem unfair or unequal, that's where we start to see change happen, and that's how great movements are made. So even simply by bringing boys and young men into our process as real team players and collaborators, we're already starting to see those shifts in mindset, which is really exciting. Part of being gender transformative is also about addressing and responding to gender-based violence and ensuring that the protection and the safety of all of our project participants, in this case, particularly girls. Part of our research protocol is a clear process for responding if a research participant discloses that she or he has experienced gender-based violence. So in our boot camps, we not only train on the process, which includes making a referral to a social support organization, but also training on empathetic listening, providing supportive messages, and overall how to respond in the moment if someone is in distress. Our protocol is really centered on informed choice. So it's the participant's choice as to whether she or he wants to access the support or report violence, but it's our responsibility to make sure that we give that information to them and help them access the support that they need. And again, gender-based violence is not the focus of our research. It's not the focus of our project, but we know that it comes up. It comes up in conversations naturally when we're talking about sex and relationships with girls and boys. And so we want to be able to effectively respond to it. And that's a critical part of the gender lens that we're applying to this project. So now let's talk a little bit about measurement. So as everybody knows, we are putting together these design standards that ask whether the offering, whether it's the insight or the how might we question or the prototype, is pushing us toward our overall health outcome of contraceptive uptake. But we also wanted to make sure that our design standards are also pushing us towards transformation of harmful gender norms. And so we've included a few examples here of ways that we want to make sure we're incorporating that gender lens as we assess our progress throughout the project. So for instance, when we're looking at insights, we might want to ask ourselves, does this insight reflect a gender norm that we might wish to reinforce if it's positive, or change if it's negative? Once we get to how might we questions or opportunity areas, we'll ask ourselves, does this question take into account the gender norms that we'll either want to reinforce or change? And does it promote gender equitable relationships between men and women, boys and girls? And lastly, when we get to the prototype and pilot phase, we'll ask ourselves whether the prototype reinforces positive gender norms or transforms negative gender norms. So these are embedded in our design standards now. And again, are going to be questions that we're asking ourselves throughout the different phases of the project to make sure that we continue to strive toward solutions and innovative ideas that not only help us reach contraceptive uptake, but are also starting to chip away at the harmful norms in society and build more champions among men and women, boys and girls, for gender equality. The same thing is going to happen with our monitoring and evaluation indicators. So again, as Clarissa said, we're not here to measure whether we have increased gender equality in a country. That's something we are striving towards, of course, but it's not going to be a measure of our success. But what we can measure are pathways toward gender equality that are integrated within the indicators for increased contraceptive uptake. So some examples might be increasing partner or family communication about sexual behavior, increasing joint reproductive health decision-making between partners, increasing support among community members for girls to access contraceptive services. And PSI has a really nice resource with validated measures of gender and GBV indicators, as well as specific GBV and gender indicators for reproductive health programming, which I can make sure I distribute after this webinar. But it's something that I think can help really guide us as we put together our M&E framework for the project. So I am going to end there. Thank you all very much for listening. And I think we can now open it up for questions, which I just need to figure out how to do that.
Why are they not like?
Oh, I'm on mute. Sorry, I unmuted everyone, so you can go ahead and just mute yourself. And then you can also unmute yourself if you have questions, or you can type into the chat window. Thanks.
And this is Clarissa. Maybe while folks are thinking of questions, Rena and I were chatting yesterday, and I know that the Ethiopia synthesis just took place a couple of weeks ago, and I was curious if folks who participated in that synthesis or who have heard updates from it had any reflections or kind of reactions to what we've just presented in terms of is anything kind of coming up so far that might fall within the kind of gender equality continuum, or just kind of any kind of insights that are related to gender norms or equality?
Clarissa, this is Manya. I was looking at, so synthesis in Ethiopia is ongoing. And I've been listening in on that for a couple of their Zoom meetings, and it's quite interesting. But something that struck me that's already come out is in the story deck from Ethiopia that's starting to take shape. One of the examples was a young married couple who are really conspiring together to come up with a story about multiple miscarriages to tell their parents, so that their parents don't pressure them too much about not having a baby right away. They're using contraceptives, and together they've got this story going that they're real co-conspirators around that story. And that it struck me as an example of a relationship where the husband and the wife and men or women are working together in their relationship.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, so in a way it is kind of transforming the gender norm around men being more engaged in reproductive health decision making. Mm-hmm. Also kind of accommodating kind of that the parent pressure around young people proving their fertility in a way, but ultimately I think it's to a good end, since the girls are using contraception and they're working toward the fertility and reproductive intentions that they have,
and with the full support of
the partner,
of her partner.
if people don't have questions, do you have maybe comments or insights from what you've seen or heard so far? Certainly from Ethiopia, but even in kind of planning for Nigeria, I'd love to hear how people are thinking about this, or if this presentation helps you think about or ask questions about what you're going to do next, for instance.
Hey, this is Daniel on idea.org. You know, something that that we've been thinking about a little bit is, you know, that spectrum of gender equality really strikes me, because I think something that we're thinking about is if we're working in an environment where all decisions have to go through a man. So for instance, if we hear a woman say, as they did often in Ethiopia, that they really can't make decisions around their reproductive health without the permission of either a parent or in many cases a male partner. Where does that put us on the gender equality spectrum? If we know what we find is that we actually need to be targeting men in order to help them, you know, bring their girlfriend or wife in for contraception. How do we factor in her agency if decisions are passed through a male partner? So it's something that's been on our mind, and that spectrum, you know, I was thinking about, well, is that exploitative, or is that sort of adaptive? You know, is that working within existing gender norms, or is it exploiting a power relationship? So I don't know, it's just a question I've been asking myself that I was struck by in this presentation.
That's a great question, Daniel. This is Rena. I'll go first and then Clarissa chime in, but it's a perfect question. And I think it's kind of the exact question that we're often asking ourselves in programs like this. So the first little check mark for success is that we're being gender aware, right? We're not being blind, and we're very aware of this gender dynamic. I would say that by engaging those male partners, because they are the gatekeepers and the decision makers, is not being exploitative. It's being accommodating, as long as we're doing it, you know, kind of as we're still doing it in a way that is, our messaging with those men is to still kind of be promoting the woman's engagement in that process and promoting joint decision making between the two of them. It might be that we do need to access those men and engage them as decision makers, but through that engagement, the hope is that we can also start to spark dialogue and conversations that lead towards more sharing of decision making between the partners. It might not happen overnight, but that's what we're striving for.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. This is Clarissa. I would completely agree. I think the risk of it being exploitative comes in if you only target men and say, okay, we're going to say, you know, women are saying men have the power. We're going to take advantage of that power, and the provider is only going to talk to the man, and the decision, you know, of whether the woman uses contraception becomes one between the man and the provider. I think that's when we would have a problem. But to Rena's point, it really is about how you are engaging both the men and the women in that process. And perhaps we're not going to be able to jump to, oh, you know, men are going to be completely supportive of women making these decisions on their own. We recognize that this takes time and might need to be accommodating to move toward the transformative approach.
I think that's a really nice way of framing it, that we're moving towards transformation. And given your experience in the field, I'd be curious to see, where have you seen programs or dynamics or sort of interventions that have really accelerated the conversation towards transformation, and maybe in ways you didn't expect, like maybe you thought it was going to have to take small bits, but you really got there quite fast.
Ooh. That's a tough question. I am racking my brain. Honestly, trying to think. You know, I'm thinking of. Yeah, honestly, all the programs that are coming to mind it's been really kind of incremental change that has taken time. I don't know, Rena, if you have.
I can't speak to a specific program where I can like speak to actual evaluation, but my hunch, which I think I hope people would agree with, and I don't know if Anna's on, if she would agree with, is that what we do know from the literature is that we've seen the most success actually with young people, which is not surprising because what we know about the adolescent brain and where young people are in their kind of cognitive and social development is that they are ripe and prime for questioning norms, questioning authority, questioning the status quo, and engaging in real critical thinking and formation of not only their own identities, but their opinions. And that in and of itself, working with young people to really kind of explore and examine gender norms and start to understand the way gender inequality manifests in their homes and societies and communities, that has been shown to work. Mm-hmm. And so I actually think that we are, as a project, really well positioned to kind of engage young people, boys and girls, in those types of really thought-provoking, critical thinking discussions and analysis, because often it is that we're all blind to this stuff until it is kind of elevated in our minds and attention, and that's when we start to question. Mm. So I do know from the literature that working with young people tends to be more successful because it's easier to change mindsets and to really form opinions of their own, right? So that does work. And I do think that it does take quite a lot of real kind of meaningful dialogue. In some of the more successfully evaluated projects, such as, for instance, the SASA project out of Uganda, which is focused on gender-based violence and HIV. But what SASA has shown and what they've really been successful at is mobilizing entire communities to have really deep and meaningful conversations about the concepts of power and gender and inequality, and getting people to question those concepts and to try to transform those concepts within their own communities. And then we've seen actual decreases in prevalence of gender-based violence in those communities. Mm-hmm. So it's not an overnight thing. It's often probably not going to be with one product or one campaign, but really in different ways that we're fostering those kinds of discussions to happen within different communities.
This is Anna, and I just wanted to add to that. I think it's sort of that balance of going both ways of, it's whether you're going to take the Freudian approach of starting from the bottom and working up, or starting from the top and working down. I think you're right that adolescents are adaptable and flexible and open to new ideas in different ways. And at the same time, they often have much less power. And so we have to be thinking about how that works into the overall dynamic, that their ability to change things may be limited because of that. The other thing that I just really want to highlight, because unfortunately, I think it was highlighted here, and it really became evident when we were talking earlier this week and doing some synthesis on the Ethiopia data, is that we also want to be mindful of trying to capture what is positive about being a girl and what are the positive parts about gender differences, because that's really missing from the Ethiopia data. And so it's coming out as a very negative thing and doesn't give us a lot to look at as far as what we want to build on that's already maybe working or maybe positive. Mm-hmm. And so I think we had been talking with IDEO about what's important. There's things that we want to transform, and then if there's things that are working, we don't want to disrupt those. And if we don't know what those things are that are working, we're going to be going in really blind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Anna, I think that's a really great point. This is Clarissa, and that's when Rena and I were kind of putting some thoughts together on the design standards. We wanted to make sure it was clear that we weren't necessarily striving for always changing things, but if there were things that were positive, that we want to be able to reinforce that. And so perhaps this is something that, as we continue to ask questions and dig deeper on the insights, that we need to be asking kind of specific questions about kind of what are those positive gender norms that we can be sure we strengthen through these interventions.
And this is Manya. What I'm interested in is, is there, okay, I'm just going to use a personal example. Sexuality, the use of contraception for me personally is very wrapped up in relationships. Like sexuality is not kind of divorced or floating separately from my relationship, from my primary relationship with my husband. And so for me, I don't see discussing any decision that I made around contraceptive use. So I would definitely include my husband, and I would want to include him. Is that, would that be something that would be a lack of agency? How would we know what's a question that we can ask ourselves about whether or not this is a dynamic that is a positive dynamic or a dynamic that we consider to be a harmful dynamic or indicative of a lack of agency? Or do you see what I mean? Is there a key question that we can use to parse that out?
So I think I understand your question, Manya. I mean, as I put in the I was going to go back to my metric slide, but I think having joint decision-making, joint reproductive health decision-making is a real ideal of gender equality. It's kind of a gold standard indicator of gender equality. And so it's absolutely something we should be striving for. A lot of it is how far we need to tip the balance of the scales as they currently stand, right? So if at the moment a girl has absolutely no agency to make any decision about contraceptive use, if it's not discussed in the home and it's, then we need to tip the scale as far the other way as we possibly can within the constraints of our own project, and see if we can strive toward that shared decision making. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, sorry, I got caught in the logistics of Zoom there for a moment.
What's emerging in Ethiopia is that there is a pretty wide range in terms of consulting with husbands, collaborating, doing things in secret, letting husbands make the decision, or not necessarily letting husbands, but husbands making that decision. It seems there's a significant amount of variation in the data that we currently have.
And Courtney, are you seeing the variation? Is it any kind of differences by age? So is it more the mothers that we're interviewing have the husbands making the decision, and the perhaps younger married women? Have you looked at that yet?
That is an excellent question. And the way that the synthesis is currently set up, when I was just with IDEO.org, it wasn't feasible to pull that out. Yeah. But I definitely think going forward, that's something that's going to be investigated. But maybe somebody from IDEO.org can better address that.
Hi, this is Courtney Chang from IDEO.org. And something, I don't think we've gotten to develop a full spectrum on where the age in this type of decision lies with an age timeline. But what's interesting is that even if the ideal is for the couple to make a family planning decision together, what happens, and then hopefully the ideal is that they agree on a method, but then what happens when they disagree and, a husband wants one thing, but what we saw were stories of the wife seizing back control and maybe circumventing the husband's desires and taking a secret method, like taking out the implant in front of him while he's at the clinic with her, and then secretly getting an injection on the side that he doesn't know about.
I think it was mixed. Sorry, this is Nicole from IDEO. Some women felt like they needed to go to the counseling with their husband because that is what was encouraged by the service providers. And then we also saw a gap in if the woman went by herself, what she might choose versus what she might choose if she went with her husband. So the women who went with their husband, the husband kind of was a little more forceful in like the decision making, like he might decide like, oh, you should get the implant. Whereas if the woman went by herself, she was more likely to get the injection.
That's interesting. We have time for one more question or comment.
Rena, this is Anna. I just had a question. Did you say that you were going to make the gender analyses that have been done available to folks? And if so, where will those be?
Yeah, absolutely. I can post them to, I think they actually went out originally with all of our Inception deliverables way back, but I'll post them again to Slack.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining and for your great comments and questions. I really hope that this was useful. Again, we kept it, somewhat basic. So the more that kind of more complex and nuanced questions come up throughout the project, please keep bringing those up. Let's continue to dialogue about these. This is not an easy thing to address. Otherwise, we would have solved it a long time ago in a lot of our countries, including our own. So I really hope that this was, thought-provoking for you and helpful for you as we go into synthesis of insights in Ethiopia and into our research in Nigeria, and then beyond into prototype development. So really appreciate you joining. Clarissa, thank you so much. And please stay in touch about this topic.
Thanks so much. This was great.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you guys.
This was great. Thank you.
Awesome.